When we think of the Gilded Age, we imagine opulence, steel barons, railroads stretching coast to coast, and gilded mansions lining the eastern seaboard. But far from the grandeur of New York or Chicago, in the ridges and hollows of Appalachia, another story was unfolding, one of survival, hardship, and resilience. This is the story of the Appalachian mountaineers during one of America's most transformative and most unequal eras. To understand the Appalachian mountaineers of the Gilded Age, we have to go back more than a century earlier to the 1700s, when waves of immigrants, primarily Scots-Irish, English, and German settlers, pushed past the eastern seaboard and into the rugged hills of the Appalachian Mountains. They weren't wealthy colonists. These were poor farmers, religious dissenters, and frontier families fleeing high rents, land scarcity, and colonial hierarchies. In Appalachia, they found steep valleys, dense forests, and rocky soil. Terrain too rough for plantations, but just manageable for the fiercely independent. These settlers developed a culture rooted in self-reliance, tight-knit kinship, and suspicion of outside authority. Government was distant, roads were few. They built what they needed, raised what they could, and leaned on neighbors when times got hard. Schools were rare, churches doubled as meeting halls. Families often lived miles apart, connected by narrow trails and oral traditions passed from one generation to the next.
By the late 1800s, the descendants of those settlers, the mountaineers, were still living in relative isolation. Their dialects preserved Elizabethan English phrasing. Their songs traced back to Celtic ballads. Their tools were often homemade. What they lacked in infrastructure, they made up for in resilience. But this isolation, once a source of pride and survival, had begun to backfire. While the rest of America entered the Gilded Age, an era of railroads, telegraphs, stock markets, and skyscrapers, Appalachia remained largely disconnected. The same qualities that had once made the region a haven for the independent now left it vulnerable. It had no capital, no political clout, and no industrial base. Instead of upward mobility, the mountaineers experienced what some historians call internal colonization. Their communities were mined for labor and raw resources, but were rarely given roads, schools, or representation in return. They were seen not as part of the American success story, but as a problem to be solved, backward, ignorant, and in need of civilizing. By the 1880s, journalists and social reformers began venturing into the hills, publishing sensationalist accounts of a people frozen in time. These narratives overlooked the structural reasons behind Appalachian poverty and instead painted mountaineers as willfully primitive. It was easier to blame culture than to question policy.
But the reality was more complex. These were not people rejecting modernity, they were simply bypassed by it. With no railroads, no steady cash economy, and no state investment in education or infrastructure, the mountaineers were forced to rely on the same methods their grandparents had used: subsistence farming, bartering, and large extended families who helped each other survive through hardship. In fact, the mountaineers were far from homogeneous. Their circumstances varied widely depending on location. A family living near a coal camp or timber route might have some access to outside goods, while those deeper in the hills relied solely on homegrown or wild harvested resources. But across the board, what united them was a shared experience of geographic and economic exclusion. Their homes were typically made of hand-hewn logs, insulated with clay or moss, and roofed with hand-split shingles. Floors were packed earth. Water came from springs or hand-dug wells. Heating and cooking were done over open fireplaces. A single room often served as kitchen, bedroom, and gathering space. Larger homes might add a second room or a loft, but luxuries were rare. And yet, within these constraints, the mountaineers created a rich cultural legacy. They preserved oral histories, crafted intricate quilts, and passed down herbal remedies rooted in both European and indigenous traditions. Their music would go on to influence American folk and country. Their storytelling preserved local histories long before outsiders thought to write them down. This was not a static people. It was a dynamic culture adapting to extraordinary hardship, just not on terms recognized by the industrial world. So when we talk about what they ate, what they earned, and how they lived during the Gilded Age, We're not just describing a menu or a household budget. We're talking about a survival system, one forged in the margins, kept alive by ingenuity, mutual aid, and sheer grit. Before we dive into their diet and finances, we need to remember these were people who, in the face of poverty, built entire lives from scratch, lives that often went unseen by the rest of the country.
The phrase Gilded Age was never meant to celebrate. It was coined as a critique by none other than Mark Twain. To gild something is to cover it with a thin layer of gold, disguising what lies beneath, and that's exactly what the era did. From the 1870s to the early 1900s, the United States transformed at breakneck speed. Railroads sprawled across the continent. Skyscrapers pierced the sky. Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Vanderbilt rose from obscurity to become household names, each one a symbol of unimaginable wealth. Wall Street boomed. Cities swelled. Immigrants poured in by the millions. It was a time of progress, but only on paper. Beneath the surface, millions were being left behind. Nowhere was this divide more visible or more invisible to the rest of the country than in Appalachia. While America's urban centers exploded with steel mills, textile factories, and telegraph lines, Appalachia stood still. There were no factories in the mountains, no skyscrapers, no millionaires. The so-called progress never reached the hollows and ridges of eastern Kentucky, western North Carolina, or rural Tennessee. For the mountaineers, the Gilded Age didn't bring railroads or prosperity. It brought silence. A country charging forward without waiting for its past to catch up. Appalachia's economy remained largely subsistence-based. The few towns that existed functioned on barter systems or sporadic trade. There were no banks. Little cash changed hands. Tools were homemade. Clothing was passed down. Food came from the soil, the woods, or the smokehouse. There was no job market in the modern sense. People didn't work for wages, they worked to survive.
This isolation wasn't accidental, it was structural. The terrain made development difficult, and what little infrastructure existed was built to extract, not to uplift. When railroads eventually came, they came to take coal, not to connect people. Companies tunneled into mountains, laid tracks to the nearest shipping depot, and left the surrounding communities as poor as they found them. And in Washington, the government didn't invest in the region. Public schools were rare, roads were unpaved, medical care was practically non-existent. While reformers worried about urban slums, few paid attention to what was happening in the hills. The mountaineers weren't seen as a labor force. They weren't seen as part of the economic engine. To elites, they were a relic, interesting to study, but not worth engaging. Appalachia was often described in newspaper articles as frozen in time, as if its people had chosen poverty over progress. But the truth is, they hadn't chosen to be excluded. They were simply never invited. It's important to remember, this was a time when America was producing more wealth than ever before. Millionaires were building palaces with marble staircases and Tiffany chandeliers. Private rail cars carried businessmen across the country. In New York, Newport, and Chicago, socialites spent more on one dinner party than a mountaineer family saw in a year. At the same time, some Appalachian families were boiling dandelion greens for dinner and stretching 1 pound of pork across a week. The contrast wasn't just sharp, it was grotesque. And yet in most history books, this disparity gets a footnote, if anything. The triumph of industrial America overshadowed the quiet endurance of rural America. Appalachia became invisible, except when it was convenient to mythologize. The Gilded Age left behind a myth that America was rising and anyone could rise with it. But in the mountains, this promise rang hollow. There were no ladders, just steep climbs and thin soil. Still, the mountaineers didn't rebel. They didn't riot. They endured. They continued to farm, to trade, to make do. They passed on their knowledge, their land, their customs. They didn't ask for wealth, they asked for a chance, but the Gilded Age wasn't designed to give them one. It was designed to shine on the surface and bury everything else in shadow. To understand the reality of Appalachian mountaineers during the Gilded Age, you have to strip away the romanticism. Life wasn't rustic, it was relentlessly hard. Every day was work. and nearly every task was a matter of necessity. The day began before sunrise. Men would head into the fields, if they had any, clearing brush, tending corn, digging root vegetables, or cutting wood. In some cases, they left to labor at sawmills or gristmills for a few cents a day. Most didn't have steady wages. There were no unions, no time clocks, and certainly no job security. Women, meanwhile, ran entire households with no electricity, no plumbing, and no appliances. Water was hauled by hand. Cooking was done over open flame. Clothes were mended again and again, and meals had to be stretched with whatever scraps were on hand. For every child to eat, someone often had to go without. Children weren't idle either. Boys helped with planting and firewood. Girls tended to siblings, washed clothes in cold creeks, and helped prepare food. Schooling was inconsistent at best. In many remote areas, schoolhouses were a luxury, and the time to attend them even more so.
The economy in these mountain communities wasn't cash-based, it was survival-based. Few families had coin or paper money. Instead, value was found in barter and labor. A bushel of corn might be exchanged for lard. A quilt might be traded for shoes. Someone might dig your well if you helped raise their barn. Tools, furniture, and clothing were passed down or handmade. Nothing was wasted. Even nails were straightened and reused. There were no banks, no insurance, no savings accounts. The closest thing to financial security was a healthy cow, a good harvest, or an extra pair of hands in the family. There was also no margin for error. A late frost could destroy your crops. A broken leg could cripple an entire household's productivity. Starvation wasn't common, but it was never far. And then came the seasons. Spring was a gamble, planting, hoping, and managing hunger after winter stores ran out. Summer was labor. Fall was harvest and preservation, smoking meat, drying fruit, salting pork. Winter was survival, especially in the higher elevations where snow made paths impassable and food stores ran thin. There was no such thing as downtime. Even rest had purpose: quilting, sharpening tools, repairing structures. People didn't talk about mental health. They didn't have the time or space to unravel. You worked, you endured, or you didn't make it. This wasn't poverty in the abstract. It was tangible, seasonal, and total. But within that hardship was a quiet kind of discipline, a learned resilience born from generations of doing what needed to be done. So, what did mountaineers eat? The short answer: whatever they could grow, preserve, or barter for. The longer answer paints a picture of limited variety, seasonal scarcity, and profound creativity with minimal resources. The average diet in Appalachia during the Gilded Age was built on 4 pillars: cornmeal, lard, salt pork, and wheat flour. Cornmeal was king. Families used it to make cornbread, grits, mush, and hominy. Sometimes they boiled it with salt, sometimes they fried it in lard. It was cheap, filling, and could be stored long-term. Wheat flour, when available, was used for biscuits, but it was less common in poorer households. Lard wasn't just a cooking fat, it was a survival tool. It added calories to an otherwise lean meal, preserved food, and could even be used medicinally. Salt pork, small fatty cuts preserved in salt or smoke, was the primary source of meat. Not steaks, not roasts, just fat and scraps boiled into beans or fried to flavor cabbage. Fresh vegetables? Sometimes potatoes and cabbage showed up, but only in the growing season, late summer to early fall. There was no year-round supply chain, no refrigerated trucks. If you wanted greens in February, you boiled dried beans and hoped they were enough. Fruit was rare. Even in harvest months, most was eaten quickly or spoiled fast without sugar and jars to preserve it. Apples might be dried and berries could be stewed, but for the poor, even this was sporadic. In fact, early USDA nutritionists were stunned by how repetitive and nutrient-deficient some Appalachian diets were. One study in Crooked Creek, Tennessee, found a rural household that consumed only 5 different foods
over a 2-week period. Another family took in 0 animal protein for days on end, just cornmeal, water, beans, and maybe some lard. Nutrition, as we think of it today, wasn't part of the conversation. Food was about calories, not vitamins. No one talked about iron deficiency or protein balance. You ate to keep working. If your children were thin and tired all the time, you assumed they'd grow out of it. And yet, within these harsh limitations, the mountaineers made food cultural. Cornbread became tradition. Beans and fatback became identity. Mealtime, even if modest, was sacred. Everyone ate together. Nothing was wasted. And when someone had more, they shared. This was not a cuisine born of choice. It was born of endurance. A plate of beans and cabbage wasn't nostalgia. It was what you could pull from the earth and stretch for days.
The mountaineer diet wasn't shaped by tradition, it was shaped by constraint. Isolation wasn't just geographic, it was economic, social, and infrastructural. The mountainous terrain made farming difficult. Most land was sloped, rocky, and thin-soiled. Only the valley floors could support more than a small garden, and those were few and far between. What food could be grown was highly seasonal and extremely local, and transportation practically non-existent. Roads were narrow and often impassable. To get to the nearest town might take a full day on foot or by mule. In the winter, those paths were often washed out or frozen. It wasn't just hard to import food, it was impossible for much of the year. There were no refrigerated boxcars, no organized food distribution networks, and no preservation technology outside of basic salting, smoking, and drying. If your crop failed or your hog died before slaughter, you didn't replace it with a trip to the store. You simply did without. Even when stores were available, they weren't well stocked. General stores and isolated communities carried the basics: salt, sugar, flour, coffee, maybe a little tobacco or soap. Exotic items like oranges, canned fish, or chocolate were luxuries most would only see a few times in their lives, if ever. And even if something rare did show up, the question remained, how do you pay for it? With no steady income, no access to banks, and no savings, families survived by bartering cornmeal for salt, eggs for thread, or labor for pork fat. Money wasn't just scarce, it was absent. That's why the mountaineer diet was repetitive. That's why it was starchy. That's why it lacked fresh produce, protein, or variety. Not because people didn't value those things, but because the entire system made accessing them nearly impossible.
From a modern perspective, the mountaineer diet was a nutritional minefield. It had calories, yes, mainly from carbohydrates and fat, but it lacked key vitamins and proteins. The result? Chronic, low-grade malnutrition. Children were often underweight and short for their age. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, left legs bowed and bones brittle. Iron deficiency led to fatigue and pallor. Dental health was poor due to a lack of calcium and rudimentary hygiene. In extreme winters, people didn't just go hungry, they starved. But because this suffering happened quietly, it rarely made headlines. These weren't urban slums packed with visible poverty. These were isolated cabins spread across hollows and ridgelines, out of sight, out of mind. And yet, despite all this, they survived. They survived by developing systems of mutual reliance. Neighbors shared what little they had. Communities gathered to butcher hogs together, can beans, or build root cellars. Women passed down recipes designed to stretch food as far as possible. Children learned to forage wild greens, hunt squirrels, and fish creeks by instinct. Food became a form of resilience. A pot of beans wasn't just nourishment, it was proof that a family had made it through another day, another winter, another harvest. It's easy to overlook these meals now, but in their time, they were acts of defiance against a system that had left these people behind.
To outsiders, Appalachian mountaineers were a mystery, or worse, a punchline. By the early 20th century, journalists and reformers had begun venturing into the hills to report on what they saw. But what they wrote was often less about accuracy and more about spectacle. They described the people as backwards, inbred, simple, or lazy. The media painted mountaineers as frozen in time, ignorant of the modern world, content to live in poverty.
This narrative stuck. It turned real suffering into regional caricature. Even popular entertainment, books, vaudeville, and early cinema jumped on the trend, reducing complex lives into stock characters. The toothless moonshiner, the feuding family, the barefoot child. None of this reflected the truth. The mountaineers weren't choosing hardship. They weren't stuck in the past. They were adapting to neglect. When roads weren't built, they made trails. When stores didn't come, they built root cellars. When schools were too far, they taught each other at home. When doctors didn't show, they turned to herbalism and home remedies. This was not a population without intelligence or ambition. It was a population without access. The poverty wasn't cultural, it was engineered through disconnection. And the diet, the so-called simple food of Appalachia that reformers scoffed at, that was ingenuity in edible form. Cornbread, beans, lard. It wasn't ideal, but it kept people alive.
By the early 1900s, the outside world finally came knocking, but not to help. It came for coal. As industrial demand for energy surged, corporations saw Appalachia not as a forgotten region, but as an untapped resource. Rail lines were finally laid, but their purpose wasn't to bring goods in, it was to take coal out. And so began the rise of the company town. Coal companies built housing, stores, and entire economies where wages were paid in scrip, a form of currency only redeemable at company-owned stores. Laborers became dependent. The self-sufficient mountaineer was now a wage worker with less freedom than ever before. Some welcomed the jobs, others resisted. Either way, the fabric of mountain life changed. Diets shifted too. Suddenly, there was more access to canned foods, white bread, sugar, and processed meat. But this wasn't nutrition, it was convenience. Malnutrition didn't vanish, it was simply masked by packaging. The culture of mutual aid began to fray. Instead of growing and sharing food, people lined up to buy it, often on credit. For many, the connection to the land and to one another started to erode. The mountaineers were now part of the modern world, but they hadn't entered it on their own terms. Today, the foodways of Appalachia are often celebrated: cornbread, soup beans, fried cabbage, proud emblems of Southern identity. But behind those recipes is a long history of survival, sacrifice, and exclusion. The meals weren't born in comfort. They were born in scarcity. The flavors we romanticize today were once the only options people had. Every biscuit was a calculation. Every winter stew was a compromise. Every spoonful of beans was a quiet victory over hunger. We often talk about the Gilded Age as a time of innovation and wealth, but for millions of Americans, especially the mountaineers, it was a time of abandonment. The Gilded Age didn't just create fortunes, it created divides between city and countryside, rich and poor, visible and invisible. And in those divides, Appalachian families planted corn, boiled cabbage, and kept going. Their story reminds us that progress isn't just about who climbs the highest, it's about who's left behind and how they survive when they're forgotten. In the end, the mountaineers didn't ask for opulence, they asked for connection, for roads, for education, for a place at the table. History didn't give it to them, but they built that table anyway, and they fed their families with it. If you found this story meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share it. Drop a comment with your thoughts, especially if your family roots trace back to Appalachia. This is the Gilded Standard, where the past still speaks.